60 years ago this May, Anthony Burgess published A Clockwork Orange, and people all around the world have been trying to ban it ever since. The most recent attempt was in 2019 by a group calling itself the Florida Citizens Alliance. A Clockwork Orange is a dystopian tale about a young gang leader who breaks into the home of an older couple with his mates and, in an act of horrendous violence, forces the husband to watch the rape of his wife. Alex is caught and sent to prison, but his sentence is reduced after he agrees to take part in a form of aversion therapy, which makes him physically sick at the thought of violence.
You have to be cured.
It was horrible.
Of course it was horrible. Violence is a very horrible thing. That's what you're learning now. Your body's learning it.
I just don't understand about feeling sick the way I did. I never used to feel sick before. I used to feel like the very opposite. I mean, doing it or watching it, I used to feel real horror show.
You felt ill this afternoon because you're getting better. You see, when we're healthy, we respond to the presence of the hateful with fear and nausea. You're becoming healthy, that's all. By this time tomorrow, you'll be healthier still.
Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation of A Clockwork Orange, which was released 10 years after the book, sparking a fresh round of outrage from concerned citizens. The film was banned by several local authorities here, and 2 years after its release, Kubrick decided to withdraw it from circulation, and it wasn't shown again in Britain until after his death in 1999. To revisit the book and the film, I'm joined by Andrew Biswell, Professor of Modern Literature at Manchester Metropolitan University and the Director of the Anthony Burgess Foundation. Andrew, welcome to Front Row. What inspired Anthony Burgess to write this novel?
I think he wanted to write the book because of a number of things that were in the air when he was first thinking about it, which is the late 1950s, early 60s. In particular, there were suggestions, proposals, and more than that, that it was possible to treat people with alcoholism or drug addiction, or even to, as it were, cure people of their homosexuality. This was quite seriously talked about, and this was done on both sides of the Atlantic. These aversion therapies were very much talked about and reported, and as far as we can see, also practiced. So I think Burgess had a very strong impulse against that. I mean, he'd been brought up a Catholic, and he believed above all in the primacy of free will. And he resisted any attempt on the part of the state to kind of impinge on the consciousness of ordinary citizens in this way.
It was published in 1962, so the height of the Cold War, and of course the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, at that time, and Burgess invented a sort of Russian-inspired slang, doesn't he, called "nadsat" for Alex and the gang, which sort of makes them even more sinister. Where did that come from?
Well, he visited Leningrad, as it was then known, in 1961. Originally a kind of holiday. He'd been commissioned by his publisher to write a travel book about Russia under Khrushchev. And it was learning Russian in the summer of 1961 that persuaded him that he'd finally found this thing he needed, a kind of slang that could be spoken by juvenile delinquents in the future. The book, he says, is set in the distant future, about 1980. And Burgess was a great learner of languages. He'd learned Malay and Chinese and Arabic and other languages, and he picked them up quite quickly. So teaching himself Russian solved this linguistic problem of how to narrate the book in a slang that didn't exist, might plausibly exist. The last thing he was interested in was kind of Soviet politics. That wasn't really his thing. If anything, he was, kind of quite the other way. But it was his interest in language above all that sort of drove him to create this this new fictional language.
And how was A Clockwork Orange received when it was first published?
Quite poorly to begin with. There were very sort of negative reviews, actually, in the Times Literary Supplement and the New Statesman. And the publisher found it very difficult to sell the book. They printed not that many copies by their own previous standards. And 5 years later, about a third of the first edition was still in their warehouse unsold. But when it was published in America in 1963, it was a slightly different story. The book began to gather a sort of momentum among the underground. People like William Burroughs and Andy Warhol got onto it. And from the mid-60s, there were quite serious talks about wanting to film it. People like the Rolling Stones were involved in that, and the Beatles. So very slowly from 1962, it took 10 years before that was achieved with Kubrick, and there have been various attempts before that, but it was a very slow burn.
How faithful was Kubrick to the book?
Pretty much, in the sense that most of the dialogue in the film is taken from the novel, but Kubrick cut certain episodes, I guess partly for length, but also I think to persuade the audience that Alex is slightly nicer than he is in the book. For example, there's a second murder which takes place in the novel, which doesn't appear in the film. And he adds certain other things. There's a very long, slightly ponderous section where Alex is first inducted into the prison that doesn't appear in the book. But on the whole, it was pretty faithful. And Burgess, when he was asked to review it, he said it was completely faithful to his vision.
So, Abir, you've read the book and seen the film. Do you think it stands the test of time?
I think it does. Well, it's a Kubrick film, so it generally does, doesn't it? It's up there with 2001 in terms of sort of cult status. I remember first watching this when it was still banned as a teenager, that frisson of excitement.
That was part of the attraction, wasn't
doing
it?
Something illicit.
It was the bootleg DVDs.
Absolutely. And for me, it's one of the three great dystopian novels of the 20th century alongside 1984 and Brave New World. It's a question as to which of them was more prescient, shall we say. But the film itself, I remember being shocked by it at the time. There are aspects of it that make me think. Well, we were talking about the Argo earlier, the Argo, the Russian-inspired language, and I wondered at the time whether it was because Burgess felt that was the way that the winds were blowing in the Cold War, that we would, all be speaking Russian at some point. And it's the other way that it's gone. We're all speaking American slang across the world. So that's interesting. But I remember the effect it had on me when I first watched
Sarah,
it.
you were banned from reading the book or watching the film by your dad, weren't you?
I was, and I realise now when you do the timeline why that happened, because he was generally quite liberal, my father, but he was anxious about that. He both read the book and watched the film. I was underage when the film originally came out, and he was very keen I shouldn't see it. And then I realised that of course it got withdrawn, so that's why I never really caught up with it. And I guess I had in my heart this sort of sense that I might find it really disturbing.
And we made you watch it.
And you made me watch it this morning, and I did find it quite disturbing. And I did find it fascinating because it is still shocking. And also because, in a sense, the bits that you know of the film, the bits that people talk about, the scenes of violence, but then the scenes where Malcolm McDowell's eyes are pinned open so that he watches the aversion therapy. They're only a tiny bit of the film. So that was the thing that sort of threw me, is that there's so much more politics and there's so much more sort of thought about the kind of society that we're producing than those two scenes were necessarily.
Andrew, it is interesting how it continues to discomfort this story, isn't it? I mean, why do you think we find it so discomforting?
I think for the reasons probably people did in 1972, because there are some extremely explicit scenes, the rape of the writer's wife that takes place quite early on in the film. And in some ways, I think Kubrick, he was exploiting a new freedom, for example, to show full frontal nudity in a mainstream studio film that hadn't been much done before. Only Ken Russell's The Devils, I think, and that film was quite heavily cut. So I think there's that aspect to it. Also, I guess the kind of playful attitude to sexuality. There's a kind of orgy scene which is speeded up, and there's the William Tell Overture played at double speed, and it's like watching the Benny Hill show. And that aspect of it, I don't know if that's shocking, but that's kind of making a joke out of sexuality as well in the same piece.
Abir, why do you think it continues to the violence to be so shocking? I mean, because you'd think we'd be inured to it by now.
Well, this is the thing. I think he was looking at an age where violence, especially amongst the young, was increasing, and he sort of forecast that into the future. What we've actually seen is we're inured to on-screen violence to a large degree, but we haven't had that explosion of violence amongst the young. We've actually had a decrease in violent crime, and I wonder what the link is there. What was really interesting for me were the social scenes, the scenes of the family, and the breakdown of the family unit in the film. And it's almost as if the opposite is happening in society to a large degree. Why is it so shocking? It's as we said, it's the violence, it's the rape scenes, it's the casual nature of it.
And I think it's also, its essential argument at some levels is about moral choice. And that took me aback. So the scenes towards the end with the politician, which I presume are from the book, where he says, I'm not interested in teaching people to be good. I'm just interested in stopping crime, seemed to me to still have a kind of real relevance today, even though, as with all dystopias, the future hasn't quite evolved as Burgess and Kubrick imagined. Nevertheless, the points it's making still kind of really strike home, in a way that did surprise me.
Andrew, I mean, people often assume that the film was banned, and it was in some countries, but actually in this country it was Kubrick who pulled it, as I mentioned, in 1973. Why did he do that?
As I understand it, it was because he was getting quite serious death threats. He and his family were threatened. They were living in England from this point, from the late 50s. And the story is that Kubrick went to the police and said, well, what can you do? And it was, I think, following their suggestion that he decided to pull it. Only in the UK, not in any other country, which I think is perhaps unique in the history of cinema, a film being suppressed just in one territory. But you're right. I mean, in other places, for example, in Ireland, the film was completely banned until 2000, when it was shown there for the first time.
And I believe that a couple of years ago you discovered a never-seen-before sequel to A Clockwork Orange in the Burgess archives, written by Burgess as a response to the moral panic surrounding the Kubrick film. What point was he making?
Well, this is the unpublished manuscript. And his substantial point, I think, is really that works of art don't create violence. That was a conviction that he'd had going right back to when he was young, when there was so much censorship around. And Ulysses, Joyce, was his favorite novel. And that was banned until he was nearly 20. So I think he has this absolute conviction that people should be able to choose, that word again, what they're reading and what they're looking at. And that works of art don't corrupt. They merely reflect these tendencies which are out there in society. There will always be, kind of wicked, criminal people. And the tendency, especially among politicians, is sometimes to blame art for creating what they don't like, what we don't like. And Burgess and Kubrick, I think, to a large extent, they thought that was getting things backwards, that art was much more kind of neutral and had an obligation to show you what evil was like.
Yes, and of course, it went on to influence many other filmmakers. You can't watch it, can you, without thinking about Quentin Tarantino. Anyway, that's Clockwork Orange. Thank you to Andrew Biswell, Sarah Crompton and Abir Mukherjee.